Hey guys, so in this lesson I want to talk about something very specific. I want to take a scale, and in this case I'm going to use a C minor scale, so that one, and I want to look at how you would take that scale and create melodies out of that. And this could be in the context of improvising, or you're writing a song, or you're coming up with a solo, or whatever. Now this is the kind of thing that you could spend a lifetime trying to get good at. And rather than sit here and talk about this for hours and hours, I'm going to give you what I think are the 4 most important things to start thinking about. So you could consider this kind of a getting started guide or something. So here's the problem. Here's what happens for a lot of people. You're starting out, you learn some chords, you learn some scales, maybe a little bit about rhythm, and you start trying to put it together. And when you do, you get some very disappointing and uninteresting sounding music. So here's an example. Let's say I'm going to take a shot at this. I'll use a C minor 7 chord. I used this in the last lesson, so hopefully it's kind of familiar. I'll go ahead and invert it, just to be a little bit clever. And then I'll play it with this kind of 6/8 rhythm. Okay. And then in my right hand, I'm just going to use this C minor scale. So my first attempt would probably sound something like this. Now, I know this is what it would probably sound like because I've taught a lot of people, and this is usually what happens the first time they try this. So, on paper, there's nothing wrong with this. The chord is nice, the rhythm is nice, the scale is, it fits, that's fine. But obviously, it's not very interesting, and I don't think anyone would call that good music. So the question is, how do you make it good? What are the things you start doing to get something good to happen? And honestly, a lot of this stuff is very counterintuitive. It's not always what you kind of instinctively do. So we will start with item number 1. When you create a melody, you need space. There's this feeling like you need to be filling the air with notes. That's kind of what you feel instinctively, but that is the opposite of what you want. If you think about like a good actor, they are very comfortable with silence. They take these long pauses and they communicate a lot with what they're not saying. And you want to do the same thing here. So if you took what I just played, this, and if you kind of graphed it out, I won't use full notation here, just kind of a basic idea of the rhythm. It would look sort of like this. It'd be note, 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 note. Now I'll show you what happens when I start putting space in here. I'm going to take this first note, I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to wait. And then I'll play the next note, and then I'll wait, and then I'll play 2 notes together, and then wait, and then 2 notes, and then finally a bigger group of notes. So it might sound something like this. Okay, I'm not doing much more than just putting a lot of space, and it sounds way better already. So here's what that would look like if you map that out. Now this isn't a perfect graph, but you can clearly see the difference between this and this. Just taking this and stretching it out and putting lots of space and making it just way more interesting by pushing things apart and putting notes in these different groups. Now you'll hear the term phrasing thrown around a lot. People will say there should be kind of a question phrase and an answer phrase, and music should sound like a sentence. And that's all fine, that's great, but it can lead you to think the wrong way, I think. A lot of times saying, that sort of question and answer phrase can a lot of times lead to something like this. It's like you have a phrase, and then you have another phrase. And that's not a whole lot better than doing this. I think just thinking in terms of space, in terms of putting silence in the music, just kind of naturally leads to the idea of phrasing. I mean, this is well phrased, but it doesn't look anything like this, and it probably shouldn't. This is not terribly interesting either. Now, like I said, this is kind of counterintuitive. If you think about someone who's nervous, a lot of times they talk way too fast and they kind of stumble over their words. When you're writing music, if you're not sure what to do, you're not super comfortable, a lot of times this is kind of what happens. You wind up putting too many notes together. And the teaching community does a terrible job with this, I think. I can't tell you how many little workbooks or exercises I've seen, where they'll give you like a couple measures or something, and they'll say, okay, for these 4 measures, fill in the melody. It's like, my melody has 2 measures of silence and then 1 note for the next 2. I mean, it would look like this. What kind of grade are you going to slap on that? Well, 1 note. So there's this kind of thinking that there needs to be a lot of stuff in a small amount of space, but there doesn't. That's almost never what you really want. Okay, so item number 1 is space. Now, honestly, this is almost enough. If you are good with space, you would be astounded at how much you can do. In fact, one of my all-time favorite piano pieces is nothing more than a couple very basic chord changes, a major scale, and some really well-chosen space. I'll put a link to it if you want to hear it. In fact, I'll play the beginning, just so you can hear what I'm talking about. It's called Travel Around Stars. And that's it. I mean, obviously that develops throughout the song, but it's not much more than that. Just some really, really well-chosen space. Okay, so item number 2. Got to keep moving here. Number 2 has to do with scales. Try not to think of scales as being scales, and I'll tell you what I mean. This is kind of a sore spot for me. Almost always when you are taught a scale, you're taught it in this very linear sense. You start at the beginning, you play it to the end, and sometimes you play it back down in the other direction. And in fact, if you ask almost anyone, hey, play me a scale, they're gonna do that. In fact, I mean, that's what I did a minute ago. It's just kind of ingrained in your head. But you are hardly ever going to play these notes in this purely linear way. Now, I know I just gave you an example of a song where that happens, but that is super rare. In fact, the reason I brought it up was because it's so rare. That's like 1% of the way you're going to do this. Like, you want to look at these notes almost like the way a painter looks at a paint palette. It's like each one is a different color, and it has a different mood attached to it, and it interacts with whatever you're playing in your left hand or the rest of the music in completely unique and different ways. For example, playing, in this case, a C, if that's my tonic note, it's very final sounding. It's almost like leaving a period at the end of a sentence. It has a very strong roll attached to it. Whereas playing a D, this is a note that's not in the chord, it's not the tonic, so it has this sort of tension attached to it, and I can use that tension to sort of, move into one of the chord tones, like this one, since this is in the chord. Right? That's a very powerful movement there because I'm using the unique properties of each note. So rather than just play up and down, I want to start looking at what each one sounds like, and trying to get these different moods attached to each one. Now this requires some knowledge of theory, or at least understanding what's happening in your left hand and what notes are part of the chord, and how they work kind of in the big picture of the key. Knowing that this is your tonic note. I'm not going to mess with harmonic scale, but a leading tone has this very tense sound, that sort of stuff. So you want to learn some theory for that, but you also just want to have a lot of hands-on experience. You want to play a lot and just really develop this feel for what the 4th scale degree sounds like when you're playing a 1 chord. Right? You'll even learn that this 6th scale degree doesn't sound very good. So I would, probably avoid harmonizing that with the chord. Now, I did a whole lesson on chord tones and non-chord tones and a lot of this stuff, so I won't talk too much about it. But that is kind of point number 2, is that you want to look at each note individually and really get a feel for what it sounds like. And you should fight every instinct to just look at this stuff as this big line of notes all in order, because that's naturally what happens when you're taught scales and you sit there and practice scales going from bottom to top. You might not even realize it, but that really gets burned into your head. Okay, so keep moving. Number 3. Number 3 is rhythm, and I'm going to spell it right for once. Now the idea here is that choosing when to play a note is every bit as important as choosing which particular note to play. And so in my case, if I'm playing in 6/8, I kind of visualize the rhythm a little bit like this. If I'm playing this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I have kind of this strong part of the beat, and then these sort of weaker parts, and then a strong part and a weaker part. That's kind of the gist of a measure of 6/8. Right? So if I choose to put a note, for example, here, then this isn't a perfect parallel, but you can almost think about that like playing a tonic or the root note. It's like a very comfortable sound. And then, if I choose to put a note, say here, it kind of sort of has this tenseness to it. It's like it's not quite what you were expecting. Now, don't take that analogy too far, because you don't necessarily need to resolve this into that or whatever, although you could. But just think of it as that, a note like this, or putting a note here, or putting a note here, has a very comfortable, predictable sound to it, and putting a note here, or there on one of these kind of weaker parts of the beat, it has this less predictable, more unexpected sound to it. So to kind of combine these two ideas, let's say that I'm going to take, thinking about what each note does, I'm going to take this scale degree number 2, and this note that's not in the chord. I'm going to play it off of this note, which is a note that is in the chord. So I get this sort of tension, resolution kind of thing. Then if I start working with the rhythm, I could say to start with, play, if I put notes right here, right on the downbeat, it's got this very solid, very predictable sound to it. If I put the note, say, here instead, I get this much looser, much kind of less predictable kind of sound. And what's really powerful is to start, combining those things. So I put some notes on beats like this, and other notes, say on these beats, so it could sound like this. Right? And just that small variation of using one of these weaker beats causes, this to go from being, very predictable and almost kind of plodding sounding to something much better, or at least more interesting to me. Right. Now, another thing you can do that I think is really cool is to do something like this, where you put a note here, put a note here, and then put a note here. Now what this does, this is a measure of 6/8, and the whole idea with 6/8 is that you have these 2 beats, and each beat has 3 little parts to it. But by doing this, you're causing this to feel almost like 3/4. It kind of feels like there's 1, 2, 3 beats in here. They call this a polyrhythm. This is a kind of a simple polyrhythm, but that is what it is. You're kind of doing these 2 separate rhythm styles at the same time. So that would sound sort of like this. I'll just use these 3 notes. Whereas the kind of normal 6/8 rhythm is something like that. So if I kind of combine these 2 things, like taking this idea of putting notes in these sort of weaker, odd spaces, and then using something like this kind of 3/4 thing, it could sound sort of like this. Something sort of like that. Point with all this is that you should look at the rhythm as much of a choice as, as choosing which note to play. You're going to be choosing when to play a note. And putting it in these different, precise locations creates completely different feels. It can change, everything about what you're playing. Okay, so the 4th thing I want to talk about is repetition. Now this can also be very counterintuitive. Same thing with space, where it feels like you're supposed to be filling the air with notes. It can feel like you're supposed to be pumping out, one cool idea after another. But in reality, that's actually very tiring for someone to listen to. It's fatiguing, the music, keeps changing, and it's hard to really, get a grip on it, and it actually just doesn't make for good music. So you actually do want to be repeating yourself. Now, often enough, that's just a literal repeat. You'll take a melody and you'll play it again later, and you might even play that, many, many times. But often you're going to do kind of more subtle things. You'll take a particular pattern and you'll repeat that pattern maybe in different places. And that gives the listener, something familiar while you're also doing something new. So for example, I could take, a little musical pattern like this. And this is a nice little gesture because it's starting on, one of those notes that isn't in the chord and then, moving to notes that are. So it's this nice little tension resolution thing again. Okay. And I could take that pattern and play it in different spots and create this really cool kind of music. So it could sound like this. And if I just kind of played down that scale, just sort of rambling and picking different notes, it would sound like that, like I'm just sort of wandering down the scale. But by taking a pattern and repeating it in different places, I'm giving the person listening something familiar to kind of, sort of guide them through that. So being repetitive is something you're going to look for and actively try to do. And the more clever you can be about it, the better. Try to repeat things. Try to repeat, similar melodies or similar patterns or similar rhythms. Give the music some themes and try to, establish those themes throughout what you're playing. Okay, so I know that can all feel very abstract. So as far as actually learning this stuff and getting good at it, here's what I recommend. Do what I would call the 2-note challenge, right? So start by choosing 2 notes, and to choose them, think carefully about this idea that certain notes have certain sounds and others have different sounds. So maybe start with these 2, a chord tone and a non-chord tone. And then, playing this, play only those 2 notes and try to explore the idea of space as much as you can, right? See how long you can go before you think your head's going to explode if you don't play another one, or just explore as many things as you can there. So it might sound like this. And just look at grouping notes and pushing them apart and doing that whole space thing. And part of that would be rhythm. Start thinking about trying to put them in as many interesting places as you can and focus on that for a while. And then maybe focus on repetition, but do one thing at a time and just try to take that idea and explore it as far as you can and start getting comfortable with all these different things. And I will leave you with one more example. This is just something that I made up today while I was filming this video. But hopefully you can just kind of hear the different elements of spacing and rhythm and repetition and that sort of stuff kind of coming together a little bit. This is still just on 1 chord, which I know is getting boring at this point, but I wanted to keep it simple. So here's just some little thing I made up. Anyway, something like that. Hope you kind of get the idea with all this. I know it's a lot, but just one thing at a time, and you should do great. That's it for now. Support me on Patreon if you want to help me make more of these. Leave me questions and comments. Let me know what you want to see next, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks.